this. So wish me luck. Imagine lecturing about the diagnosis and treatment of various mental illnesses to a group of college students, a disproportionate number of whom have either themselves struggled with some form of mental illness or who currently live among others who have. And imagine that for their entire lives, until now, until your class, these students have probably had little or no access to information on this topic. Imagine talking about the themes of masculinity and the banality of violence in George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant in a place where one of the greatest everyday sources of physical danger is people who are trying to save face. Imagine reading Kafka's The Trial while literally subject to one of the most terrifyingly dysfunctional bureaucratic systems this country has ever known. Imagine teaching a class on the US Constitution and explaining to a group of prisoners that the 13th Amendment bars slavery and involuntary servitude except in cases of punishment. Bringing these kinds of texts into San Quentin, I have often felt like I was returning stolen property to its rightful owner. I've wondered at how texts like these could have been withheld for so long from people who not only understand them so well, but who need them so badly. I haven't felt so much generous and heroic as I have often felt confused, apologetic, and even ashamed. It always feels like too little, too late. We should have been here long ago, and there should be many, many more of us here right now. In certain respects, I've had a similar reaction when witnessing the physical and emotional intensity with which the students in this program are committed to getting an education, how hard they push themselves through physical exhaustion, and how they manage to cope with the constant noise, the steady interruptions, and what has to be the most unergonomic academic environment imaginable. That means allowing yourself to use your body the way it was meant to be used, right? Among other things, college and prison means reading and writing for long hours on a bunk bed without a desk or a chair. And for most people, it means completing all assignments with a pencil. This feeling of mine is intensified when I contrast what I see at San Quentin with my sometimes very bleak memories of my own performance as an undergraduate, or even with the very half-hearted, or let's just say deeply ambivalent relationship to school demonstrated by so many undergraduate students in conventional college classrooms. For me, it's the infuriating juxtaposition of someone on a diet with someone who's starving. The larger issue here, the irrationality and injustice of unequal access to education, the fact that there is rarely a direct correlation between who wants or needs education the most and who gets it, quickly engulfs almost anyone who spends time in these classrooms. I'm gonna drink some water. Hang on. But it's not just about access. It's also what results intellectually when the material content and standard practices of each academic field get held up in a prison classroom like an X-ray is held up against a light. Scholars and experts suddenly see all sorts of gaps and fractures in their own disciplines that they'd never really noticed before as they're asked to explain things that they've never in their lives heard someone question. How do you know that? Why do we have to do it that way? And maybe if we have some discussion afterwards, some of the teachers here can offer their own examples of that experience. Sometimes academic inexperience can be a person's greatest source of intellectual strength and originality. Most students at San Quentin haven't been immersed in academia long enough to have memorized its many conventions or to have learned to accept them passively on faith. Plus, no one in this environment trusts anyone without cause, so why should they trust us? But yet another way in which these students challenge the traditional academic world and thereby make their teachers wiser is through the very fact that many of them also occupy social or cultural positions which in the academy, and often even in the professional world, I'm thinking of you, David, when I write this, are generally either entirely absent or figure only as exoticized abstractions. People talk and write every day, for example, in the fields of sociology, psychology, public policy, political science, public health, and journalism about the drug dealer, the addict, the sex offender, or the gang member. But how many people to whom these terms refer are themselves actively participating in the discussion? How many of them worked on writing the textbook for the class? What's important here is not just the presence of individuals who can speak from firsthand experience, but rather it's the reminder that those individuals have voices, that there are actual human beings trapped behind those terms and categories. My point is not to suggest that these students represent an alternative or authentic voice for any of these categories. Nobody can do that. No such thing exists. My point, rather, is that those who are traditionally only spoken about must be allowed to speak and be heard. This is not only an ethical issue. These individuals simply add vital insight and knowledge to the discussion itself. Their presence and participation simply makes everyone smarter. Of course, one of the most curious and cliched attributes of the traditional academic world is how often its discussions take place far removed from their actual subject matter. You would sometimes think we were all astronomers. But I would suggest that this problem of academia is actually, to a large extent, the problem of the world generally. It's not just that our isolation or someone else's exclusion limits our actual understanding of that which we study. An even more pressing problem is that we rarely seem to grasp how little we actually know. We always think we know everything, and this gets worse the more degrees you have, right? Ignorance is perhaps, by definition, a void that is always filling itself instantly with speculation, rumor, myth, and fantasy. Lack of knowledge is just lack of knowledge, right? That's not really ignorance. Even worse is that we often become invested culturally, psychologically, and politically in our own ignorant notions of who other people are. Long before we realize it, for example, we are learning to imagine people in prison as grotesque, subhuman caricatures. Criminals, prisoners, ex-convicts, parolees, they're the stuff of horror movies, nightmares, Halloween costumes, primetime television, and offhand jokes. At St. Quentin, outsiders actually meet and get to know human beings who are literally subject to these categories. I sometimes tell people when they ask me what I do for a living that I run a study abroad program for clueless white people. Yet it is certainly not just the mere fact of coming face to face with people in prison that affects us so deeply. If it were, correctional officers, for example, would be having the same experience, which they frequently do not. Rather, it's the specific social and psychological context in which we meet. It's the classroom. And the dynamic that this creates between us, which allows us to get to know the human and often very vulnerable parts of our students. We get to see precisely that which has so often eluded others and sometimes even them themselves. What's interesting and often very hard to understand, particularly for many of us who've worked in this field for a long time, is how widespread and intense the political opposition often is to programs like this one, which would seem to do nothing but good for everybody involved. Prison college programs help make prisons safer. They also help people grow intellectually and emotionally. They prepare them for successful lives after prison, and they dramatically reduce the likelihood of their reoffending and returning to prison after they're released. This all, of course, prevents crime and saves the state a great deal of money. It also saves lives. I would suggest that the answer to the question of why so many people continue to oppose programs like this one lies at least in part in the fact that there are hundreds and thousands of people in the US right now who are not in prison, who would react with much the same intensity and gratitude to the opportunity to be in college as the students at St. Quentin do. Some, or maybe many of these people, have often also lived economically or psychologically precarious lives. They too have often been extremely ill-served by this country's public schools. Hundreds and thousands of people in this country, not just prisoners, live their lives isolated from the realms of information and opportunity into which higher education provides a key point of entry. For a long time, I simply felt rage and disbelief when I encountered people who would oppose a project that was as overwhelmingly positive as this one obviously was. These conservatives, as I imagine them, were simply irrational, stupid, and even sadistic.